Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
We assume that's the Bahamas. 544 miles per hour, 46, 56 degrees.
We'll get right to the panel. I'll first ask them to talk a little bit about their work and reactions to the movie, if they have any. And we also have some visuals related to the work of the people on the panel. So, Jess, you get to go first. Introduce yourself, please.
Perfect. Thank you to Filmstream for having us, and go ahead and put the first slide up, please.
Okay, there you go, Jess.
All right, my name's Jess Benjamin. My imagination was trained in the irrigation ditches on the 100th Meridian line. I was born in Cozad, Nebraska. My ceramic artwork focuses on water usage in the Great Plains area, a regional concern that is related to the phenomenon of global drought. As a nation driven by the imperative of overconsumption, the United States has become greatly dependent on commodities that require large quantities of diminishing water. The artwork on screen is titled Hoover Dam Intake Towers and is made entirely of clay, even the rebar. These towers stand at 7 feet tall. Lake Mead is currently well below half capacity, exposing parts of the towers that have been underwater for years. Next.
Okay.
Below 8 states in the Midwest lies the greatest underground water reserve in the world, the Ogallala Aquifer. Since 2000, I have witnessed how the drought-like conditions in the Midwest, I've witnessed how people have responded to the drought-like conditions in the Midwest, and I've witnessed, I wrote that twice, so I guess I'm just going to say it multiple times. This piece was the first of a series titled Dried Up on the Ogallala Aquifer. This piece is essentially a mapping of the Ogallala Aquifer. It was the first of a series titled Dried Up on the Ogallala Aquifer. I used cartographic color, blue, green, yellow, orange, red, and maroon to map the amount of water in the aquifer. Nebraska is essentially blue and green. We have the most water in the aquifer due to the collection of rainwater and snowfall in the Nebraska sandhills. Scientists have predicted this to go dry by 2022. Parts in Texas. Next. I create objects that often center around things that either do not or should not be seen. Intake towers at Hoover Dam and eroded jackstone-faced earthen dams that should remain underwater, but are exposed in times of drought. The artwork on screen is called Dam Nebraska and is 10 feet in length. It is inspired by the jackstones used on Kingsley Dam at Lake McConaughey in Ogallala, Nebraska. Lake Mac was created to store water for irrigation, generate electricity, and to prevent floods shortly after the Dust Bowl. The jackstones lock together and act as one on the face of the dam to help prevent erosion. I've worked on this piece for almost 10 years and have doubled its size since this image was taken. This artwork references the increasing struggle over water rights and is a battered reminder of the problems we face. As far as my take on the movie,
We're all waiting.
that was weird. But I'm an object maker, so I always focus on the objects, and I believe that an object has a very powerful story to tell. The object that I focused on in that movie was always the glass. And every glass that they drank from was a glass. It wasn't a plastic glass. And everything in that glass was always clear, even though it was gin. I think most of the time, right? Wasn't it gin? Something like that. And so I was just kind of fascinated. I kept watching every single glass, and I think there was only one glass that was brown water. And I wasn't listening to any of the language at that time of that brown water, but I didn't think the story was kind of taking a dive for him at that time. So that's what I got. Weird.
All right. Next, Mace Hack with the Nature Conservancy. Mace?
Yeah, thank you all for being here tonight. I was running through my mind about that movie, and you know, it ostensibly is about water, although it's about much more than that. And so the theme I want to talk about, though, is water, and clearly, you know, what happens on this home planet is a lack of water, and our planet, you know, our planet has the name the planet of water, which I think is very telling, because we do, you know, water is the source of all life on this planet. Our mission as an organization is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. It's not just nature, it's human beings as well. And we work around the world, it's about 70 countries around the world, and in every state in this country, trying to figure out how do we make sure we have healthy lands and clean, abundant waters for future generations. And so in some respects, this movie sort of shows a future that we could end up in, that we may be heading towards. But our work in Nebraska, and I don't know if I'm even gonna, you know, Nebraska has more acres of irrigated farmland than any state in the country. And this is just a picture of what our landscape looks like out in the central part of the state. The little, maybe you can make out the little green squares. Those are all 160 acres of irrigated land. Every one of those has its own sprinkler system that is irrigating the land to grow basically corn and soybeans. In Nebraska, 90% of our water consumption goes to produce crops like this. And it's a huge driver of our water use, and we're hugely dependent on the natural water we get through the state, whether it's snows melting in the Rocky Mountains and flowing down the Platte River and other rivers, or, you know, local rain or water coming up from the Ogallala Aquifer that Jess mentioned, that really sustains our life here and also sustains life in many places, all the places that our food goes to. I think I have a slide in there of what one of these big irrigation systems look like. They're called center pivots, and they basically are a big circle. They're sort of anchored in the center where the well is, and it squirts water out these pipes, and that's why when you fly over them, they look like circles. They just rotate around these fields. They consume a huge amount of water. During the summertime, when these are running to irrigate our crops, the city of Lincoln, which is what, 250,000 people, 270,000 people, the water consumed by the people in the city of Lincoln in one day is equivalent to only 11 of these center pivots. And we have over 100,000 of these around the state. So the vast majority of water consumed in this state is irrigation for growing crops. So we take a very pragmatic view of that. If we want to try to get more water back in our natural systems, back in our river systems, back in our wetland systems, we have to go to where that water is being consumed and work with farmers. None of us have foregone eating, although that wasn't something interesting. I don't think we never saw the character Newton ever eat anything. He just drank the whole time. Well, of course, we can't do that. We have to eat. So if we want food, we have to be able to grow it. And at the same time, we want more of a balance in terms of how our water is being used. And so we are working with farmers in Nebraska and elsewhere, trying to figure out if we can make farming more efficient in its use of water, because of the vast amount being consumed by agriculture. We can, small efficiencies can have a huge impact on the water available for other things. And just to give you an example, these pictures show what a typical farm field might look like, and the different colors are different types of soil. Unlike your lawn, where you just dump water by a sprinkler across the whole lawn, if you actually could take into account the differences in the soils and their different ability to use water to grow a crop, and you could alter how much water you put in the field according to these different patterns, you could actually make sure you're putting just the right amount of water in just the right part of the field, and not just use too much water or too little water. And that's one of the tools we're helping to bring to farmers, using technology so that they can understand the detailed characteristics of their fields, match their sprinkler system to those characteristics and maximize the use of every drop of water and not waste it. So a lot of it is about bringing technology, and farmers actually are a very savvy group of producers who know how to use technology to increase efficiency. That not only lowers the amount of water they need to use, it also increases their profitability, which in this day and age and human nature, that's going to be a winning solution. We don't want to necessarily force people to do things that aren't in their interests. If they can make money by being more efficient in their use of water, that's a win for nature, that's a win for people, it's a win for our food. So that's how we sort of approach this topic, and I'm happy to go into more detail if there's any questions about that, but I think I'll pass it on to my colleague Bowie.
Well, again, thank you all for staying after the screening. One major thing I took from the movie, this is kind of like the second time I saw it. First, I attempted to watch it a few days ago, and I just did something else and never came back. But this time around, I kind of found it fascinating. There's like 150 plots going on at the same time, and all centered around water. And the biggest takeaway for me there is that it's never just about water. I mean, anywhere you go, water is the focal point, but life revolves around that water. And I thought it was interesting in the movie, they weren't just focused on the water aspect of it, but what goes on in their lives and other people's lives. With the organization I run is called Aqua Africa, and I'm originally from South Sudan. And when I was a child, when I was back in in Sudan, during that time was called Sudan, and we're in a civil war. So water was a huge issue for us because as a country, as the largest country in Africa at the time, we didn't have a lot of access to water. A lot of it was just trapped underground. So right now what we do is we drill water wells, and part of that is to provide people in communities, about 500 people per well. But the reason why we do that, we say our mission is to provide access to clean water, but our vision is to see develop South Sudan. Just like the movie, just because they have access to clean water, that's not the end of it. There has to be life around the water as well. So what we do is basically drill on water, and what we call a micro-democracy approach, our micro-democracy program, we help elect 6 members of committees to run the water. So they make decisions how much water is used, what fees they're going to charge, and things of that nature. And then we do what's called resource management. And the biggest thing we try to teach is water may be free like the air, but accessing water is not free. Transporting water is not free. And I thought that was another interesting point in the movie. Outside, we have an exhibit to show how difficult it is transporting water. So when I was a child, my mom walked to the Nile River. We lived 3 miles away from the Nile. And my mom would walk to the river and bring water back. And whenever I tell people that, they're like, oh, 3 miles, that's far. Yeah, but imagine bringing the water back. 5 gallons is nothing to laugh at. So, and unfortunately, a lot of women are forced to do that. And it's not because we are picking on women. It's because they put it on top of their head, they align it with their spine, and they're able to travel a lot further than us guys. Us guys are awkward with it. We roll around, take a lot of breaks, and they don't like that. So, but that's what we do. And I for the most part, I found that fascinating. And really quick, I work with Mike now. Actually, Mike is our operations committee chair, and we build water tanks there. It's amazing to me. Talk about worlds away. Mike is in the United States in Omaha, designing a water tank for South Sudan. So I thought that was another interesting parallel between the movie and what's going on now. So, but I'll yield the rest of the time.
All right, I got to just ask one question of the panel, so the thought I had when watching the movie is, even though David Bowie depleted our gin supply, he did not get our water. But so if he really didn't die, but he's out there working for another state who wants Nebraska's water, is there a risk of our water supplies in Nebraska being transferred out of the state? Anybody claim any expertise on that?
Is this one on? So our current laws prohibit that, but that doesn't prohibit people from dreaming, particularly people in Denver, which is very big, powerful, and hungry for water, from dreaming about the aquifer that Jess referred to, the High Plains or Ogallala Aquifer, which sits under the sandhills in Nebraska. Well, underlies a lot of Nebraska, but the deepest part is under the sandhills, and that amount of water is 3.5 times the size of Lake Erie. So that's a tremendous amount of water that's very close to the surface. If you were to pump all that water out, you could cover the entire state of Nebraska in 44 feet of water. So that's a staggering amount of water. Now, places like the Front Range that are already hungry for water, and will probably become more so with climate change as snowpack in the Rockies diminishes. There's always that threat, and there's certainly been ideas over time. I've been in Nebraska 17 years, and I've already encountered a couple of crazy ideas, building a pipeline from the sandhills to Denver, or filling up train cars, that kind of thing. I think that's kind of distant because we in Nebraska really care about our water, but the sort of so-called camel's nose under the tent, a little bit of chink in that armor, to mix metaphors, is that we are starting to think about taking water from one part of the state and transferring it to another part of the state to solve a water drought in one part of the state that hasn't been able to solve its problems on its own. Let's take water from somewhere else. And unfortunately, that has not happened yet, but there are some people who are really pushing hard for that. I think when that happens, then if it happens, and I hope it doesn't, that could potentially weaken our case to protect our own water and not have it go somewhere else. So we need to be cognizant of that and really protect our water in this state. It sustains a tremendous amount of life.
Okay, are there questions in the audience? Yeah, there's one right there on the aisle.
Hi, I've got a couple of things. Thank you for being here. And first, I was curious if you exhibited anything in the water exhibit that was recently at Coneco. I apologize for not knowing the answer. Second, thank you for working on technology for the state of Nebraska and using water in a smarter way, because it seems like it's hard to change it in any other way. And thirdly, can you tell us a bit about, is it Acacia National Park, that one of the big companies that sells water like Nestle is taking all their water from there at no charge and bankrupting the park? Can you tell us anything about that? Are you familiar with that issue?
Jess, do you want to start? Were you part of Coneco's exhibit?
No. But it was a really good idea. A personal friend of mine, Sue Knight, she had the pod pieces, the ones that kind of mimicked the fishing nets. I think that was probably the biggest piece that was received in that area. What was the Acacia National Park? Actually, Mike, you were speaking about bottled water right in the beginning. We were all talking about every water panel we're ever on, we're always presented with bottled water that's put in front of us. And when we met a few weeks ago and we had that discussion, we were talking, it takes 7 times the water that's in the bottle to produce the bottle. Mike was also reflecting upon how there isn't a lot of control in the water that is bottled, that essentially we don't know where it's coming from. There's looser regulations, but I don't have any specific knowledge to that area that you were talking about. Does anyone else?
Yeah.
I'm afraid I don't have specific knowledge of that example you bring up either. But I think one thing to think about as a consumer is when we purchase, it's not just water bottles, but food. I mean, food is mostly water, and so we move water around in the shape of food all over the world. And I think as consumers, we should try to be cognizant of that. There are some places where we are sourcing some of our food that is not growing that. A lot of places are not growing that food sustainably, and in fact are taxing their water supplies. So we as consumers, I think, can play a real role in in the availability of water and that tremendous movement of water through food products around the globe. So think about where your products are coming from and what's happening to the water sources in those areas where they're being produced.
Other questions? Yes, right middle.
Hi, I would like to ask a question about working with farmers and how they use their water supply and some of the challenges that maybe may not be so easy to work with and how to fix them. And what's the challenges working with them and trying to get over that, and what somebody should be aware of when thinking about that.
How do you work with a farmer? Luckily, my parents are farmers, so I spend a lot of time in closets with farmers, usually drinking clear liquids, but out of beer cans, not glasses. The farmer has been fairly proactive, and it probably isn't publicized enough, the amount of technology that goes in agriculture these days. There's satellite systems that are in our $500,000 combines. Essentially, my father can watch the combine go through the field as it's harvesting. That information is then sent to the agronomist, who is also their soil expert, who acts as their advisor to help them manage their irrigation. And when you were talking about these pivot irrigation systems, yes, they use a lot of water, but they're using a lot less water than what we were using in surface irrigation. And kind of the reason for the introduction of these pivot irrigation systems was technology. The technology of our smartphones has driven immensely because farmers have had the need for a smartphone. And it basically costs my father about $2,000 a year to have his pivot on his smartphone. He can't work his smartphone, but my mom can, and she can turn the pivot on and off from great distances so that they're only, essentially irrigating right when they need to during those important times. So it's getting a lot more efficient. But it goes back to your point of what are we using our water for? We're growing food with the majority of this water, and over 40% of our food is thrown away. So, we can't always place the blame on the farmer. We can't always place the blame on industry and agriculture in general. We have to shoulder this ourselves and really start to get connected again with that food source. So I'm going to challenge all of you to start to think about what you throw away from what's already been grown. Otherwise, it's kind of pointless to talk about conservation if all of us don't step up and start to think about what we consume and how much we consume of it.
Mace, do you have a comment about working with farmers?
Well, farmers are just like any other people. They want to provide for their families. They want to do the right thing, and so I think it's just a matter of building trust, which traditionally, environmental groups and farmers have not necessarily been always on the same side. So a lot of it's trust building. A lot of it is putting our credibility and our resources at stake to try to come to a mutual solution, and it takes time. But the nice thing about it is that once you get a group going who are, we have a group of farmers out in western Nebraska. They are now teaching other farmers around the state and opening the door for us. So hopefully it's something we're hoping it'll sort of go viral. But it takes patience and it takes trust. And, I think it takes an attitude that farmers are not the problem, but farmers are a solution, and not just with water issues, but with things like climate change too and other issues. So it takes a little bit of a change in a mindset and just try to put yourself in their shoes, which is not necessarily a traditional role that environmental groups have played, but I think ultimately that's how we're going to get to lasting solutions.
I just have a quick one. You started right on it, thinking about climate change and the water shortage or potential shortage. Are they connected at all, or do we have two different problems? In other words, the people that are dissing climate change, are they also dissing the water problem too, and saying that's not an issue?
Well, I think water is more top of mind. I think, well, it's interesting. I mean, I think, again, we go back to farmers, and not just farmers, but ranchers who really depend very much on nature for their livelihoods. If a poll done a couple years ago in Nebraska showed that 61% of rural Nebraskans, most of whom are in agriculture, favor the state creating a action plan for how to deal with climate change, which I think surprises a lot of people. I think we think of maybe that population as not being that in tune with climate change just because of sort of the political stripe of a lot of rural Nebraska. So I think, but farmers and ranchers are very close to land and know that the climate is changing. They see it in the outcome of their sorry. Of their products. So I think water is actually a good way to try to wake people up to some of the long-term changes with climate. So I think they are related, and hopefully will be a way to sort of bring again some solutions. I think it's a tough sell leading with climate change actually in the state still, unfortunately. But there's a good base out there in rural Nebraska that's looking for some action. So something to build on. That
Bowie, are you seeing any impacts of climate change on your work in South Sudan?
Well, when it comes to climate change, obviously we share the Nile with 4 other countries, Egypt, Ethiopia, Uganda, and now Sudan as well. So right now, a lot of the thought when it comes to climate change, of course, is a lot of demand on water and in these various countries for agriculture. So it's becoming drier. Over the past 5, 6, 7 years, we've seen, I mean, a dramatic increase in water usage, but that has led to huge conflicts between us and particularly Egypt, because the water negotiations were done in the colonial times. So South Sudan and Kenya and Ethiopia now want to renegotiate what's going on. There's not a clear link for us. I mean, from what I know, there's not a clear link between a scientific correlation between climate change and our water usage, but there's definitely been, for the past, like I said, 5, 6 years, an increase in water usage, and that has led to major conflict between us, Egypt, Ethiopia now is involved. So, I mean, that's where we stand now.
Right. Gentleman in front had a question. Great.
I guess for a long time I've been obsessed about potable water. Of course, I've been obsessed about the upcoming petroleum wars, the upcoming water wars. There's going to be obviously increasing shortage of water. My concern about potable water is that we have this incredible infrastructure for potable water, of which maybe 1% is actually consumed. Doesn't need. I mean, do we need potable water down the toilet? Do we need potable water in you know, on our lawns? Are we going to overproduce something that is wasted? I mean, for something that is so important, potable water, when water itself is going to be short, I don't know. I'm confused as to, you know, well, any comments about overproduction of potable water when there's a real need for water?
I'll comment a little bit, and then anybody else can take a shot. But I think in Nebraska, we have the luxury that water is cheap, and therefore it's easy to use that potable water for uses that you don't really need to. In drier parts of the country, you're starting to see changes being made. You're starting to see gray water systems where water from washing machines and sinks is used for lawn irrigation. You're starting to see treated effluent from sewage treatment plants being used for golf course irrigation and other types of irrigation. And I will say that I've tracked with MUD for a number of years the per capita usage of potable water around here, and it is going down on a per capita basis because we're using much more efficient plumbing fixtures and aerators for your faucets and things like that. But I think here in Nebraska we have the luxury that the water is still pretty available and pretty cheap, and there's not the incentive yet to do all the things that we could do and that's being done in other areas.
Really quick, I think the largest thing, I think we kind of covered this the last time we met and kind of talked, but if you look at South Sudan right now, currently South Sudan has a population about 10 million to 12 million, depending on what census you look at. And you look at Ethiopia, which is 80 million to 90 million people. I think the obvious fact is the number of people, population. And the more people you have, the more you need to produce in terms of agriculture, the more people you need to feed. And you could take as many less showers as you want, and you could get rid of the bathrooms as much as you want if you don't deal with the agricultural production. I usually joke my wife does a lot more than I do when it comes to saving water because she's a vegetarian, soon to become vegan, which is going to make our family difficult, but that's something we're going to have to deal with. But I think that's the major thing I wanted to point out. It's overpopulation. Now they're saying, you know, over the next few years, 9 billion people that we need to feed? I mean, taking 10 minutes less shower isn't going to do it. So I think in developing countries and things like that, addressing population growth, I think has to be part of the solution. I know it's not a politically nice thing to say, but that's the reality.
And that goes back to kind of that personal responsibility of you make that choice of, I'm only going to have one kid, not 5. And we've kind of seen that change happening. There's a lot of us that are a lot more concerned about this. But when we think about kind of the history of water, or what we want to call the American water problem. I think, Bowie, your country has a lot bigger problems than ours. Americans, we want to call this a crisis. We want to have this, you know, we're having this problem, we're going to run out of water. Right now, it's a problem. And if we keep things in perspective, we didn't really even have irrigation until after the Dust Bowl. It took us an entire natural disaster of our Midwest, and it was somewhat of a man-made natural disaster, okay? We broke the sod, and then it blew and blew and blew. But the thing that we always forget about is it wasn't so much the dust, but it was the floods that came after. And that's why our country built all of these lakes and dams to, one, store water for irrigation so that when we were in times of drought, we wouldn't go through that again, but then also so that we could prevent the flooding. And recently, we've kind of seen it happen here immediately in Nebraska. In 2012, the state of Nebraska was at 88% extreme drought. 6 months ago, California, does anybody have the statistic? Was it less than 50% extreme drought? But California was in the news constantly. They're one of the major users of water, and the majority of their water is going for agriculture. It goes back to kind of your first question of, do you see that happening in Nebraska of water being sold? That was happening in California a long time ago when the farmers sold their water rights to San Diego, and now they're all really grumpy with one another. So let's not always try to think of this as a crisis, but this is a problem. scientists are just now really understanding what the Ogallala Aquifer is. I mean, we didn't have the technology really 40 years ago to understand what it is. Now we have some massive technology that is giving us, you know, acre by acre water graphs of our water usage and where we can go. So that's one way of fixing the problem. But then it also comes back full circle. We're going to increase the number of mouths that we need to feed. I'm with you. Blame the babies. The babies are to blame for everything. So how do we teach these babies to use less than what we're using? How do we do that? Do we need something different in our education system? Why is home economics taken out? None of us know how to cook anymore. I'm one of them. I don't know how to cook, and home economics was cut out of that. But I do know how to grow food, which I do. So I'm just hoping the next generation, and that's what I'm trying to do with my child, is teach that next generation to consume less, learn where your food comes from, and learn how to cook it. Because I know from experience that I don't throw away food that I grew myself. But I will if I bought it from the grocery store and it's expired.
I think we have a question or comment here.
Does Nebraska have crop options that would use less water? So we talked about how Nebraska is predominantly corn and soybeans. Are there other things we could grow or produce economically to sort of replace and reduce our water consumption?
Yes and no. Right now, corn is our main commodity, basically because it can be used so many times. We can grow it to produce ethanol. The byproduct from ethanol, called distiller's cake, is then fed to the feedlots. For example, Dar feedlot grows 60,000 head of cattle. All of that food comes within 20 square miles of putting up a 2 million wet corn pit and then feeding the distiller's cake, which has entirely changed our landscape. You know, everything has been flattened even more for these pivots, which changes your habitat. And crop circles, edges, you know, we've lost alfalfa because of this. One major crop that's pretty interesting is industrial hemp. It has much more starch content than corn, but it's illegal. You know, which it's changing in certain states, but the technology to harvest hemp and then also to convert it isn't quite there yet as well. University of Nebraska Lincoln began studying it a few years ago.
Just one clarification. We grow a lot of wheat in this state too, and most of that's not irrigated. So that would be in western Nebraska. So wheat is an option in some places. And there are other cereal grains that one can grow, but the productivity of the land is then less, the profitability, et cetera. So kind of the incentive structure drives towards corn and soy and wheat. And together with Illinois and Iowa, we produce 40% of the country's corn, soy, and wheat. So 40%.
Maybe one more question in the middle there.
I have a question for Bowie I was very intrigued by the idea of setting up what you call micro-democracies in the communities where you dig wells. And I'm wondering how much variety you see in how people choose to kind of govern and organize their water. And also if there's anything that you've seen done in these communities that you think might apply to the way that we manage water in the U.S.
Well, I'll just tell you a specific story. In 2015, we built what was called like a village supplier with Mike's team at Lamper Renierson. And the village supplier is a water system basically and has water distribution points in different areas. And each distribution point has, we set up a committee through the micro-democracy process where they elect their people. Initially, a lot of nepotism took over. So they elected people that they liked and et cetera. That happened, and a few months, or actually about 4 months ago, the power box of the water tank broke. So, and as soon as it broke, like the people have to pay for it now. So they went several months without having the water tank. It wasn't working. So we went to them and say, hey, unless you pay, we won't bring this back up. And then they said, well, $2,000 US is 98,000 South Sudanese pounds. There's no way we could afford it. So we said, all right, let's negotiate something. You guys work out a deal, talk amongst yourselves, and come back to us. What they ended up doing was they got rid of the committees that were elected initially, that were supposed to collect fees and things like that. They re-elected new members. Over 90% of them were women, whereas before, majority of them were men. So, and then the women came back, they renegotiated, and then they borrowed basically the money to pay it back within 2 years to have their thing. So for that, more than any other thing, showed us where, like, as soon as they ran into problems, that's when the committee started working. That's when conservation started working. That's when they started thinking about how it works. And like I said earlier, a lot of the times when we go into the communities, they say like water like air should be free, and we agree with that. Water like air should be free, but the mechanism in getting the water and purifying it or treating it is not free. Therefore, that's what costs to maintain, and that's what costs people money. But how does that translate to water policy here in the States? Unfortunately, I don't know enough about that to speak on that behalf, so I'm sorry about that. Going to have to forgive me on that, but I could pass it to my colleagues here, if that applies any.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, the stakeholders who have most at stake, the women who have to otherwise carry the water, seize the power and come up with a solution. That's a wonderful model. In Nebraska, we have natural resource districts, which are kind of based a little bit on that. They're more local control, locally elected. They unfortunately don't tend to be very broad-based in a lot of parts of the state of the electorate. But the idea is there that there is some more local control as opposed to sort of top-down control. So maybe that's a parallel. You got any good thoughts on that? It's a good question.
Okay, well, thank you. Okay, one last question.
Yeah, I think
way up
we have
at the
time
top.
for one more here.
Hi. I have a question about how you guys feel about like factory farming. Considering like a few years ago, I think Nebraska waterways were like rated the 6th worst in the nation, largely due to Tyson fresh meats. And just to produce a pound of beef takes almost 2,000 tons of water. So I'm curious, given that factory farming and livestock farming is such a main source of income in Nebraska, how do you guys like deal with water conservation but also not totally destroying Nebraska's profit?
Factory farming. Farmers aren't a factory. They're small people. It's actually a fairly small operation, small amount of people that are employed in the majority of the farms. I do understand the kind of large scale issue, but the reason why it's kind of gone to this factory farming type, as you say, was largely due to the 1980s when your farm markets crashed and everyone went broke. So that's when we lost the majority of our farmers, our numbers. You know, you used to be able to work on 2 acres of land really to support your family, or a quarter section of land or this. But then when the prices went down and the banks continued to loan farmers money, we lost a lot of knowledge of those people. So I would like to think that, you know, really the strong survived. And then efficiency became more and more, and the demand for what these farmers produce became even more. You know, our dependency on oil, I think America has always tried to get away from needing foreign oil so much. I think it was 15 years ago, I paid 98 cents a gallon when I went to college or something like that. and now I'm paying $2.15. When my father went to college, it was 5 cents per gallon. So I think when that big of thing changes, you know, our whole infrastructure is going to change. And there's been more and more regulations put on farming here recently because we actually have the information that proves that there is these problems, you know, of water runoff. Whereas, you know, really 30 years ago, they didn't know the chemical they were spraying on the crops was killing the bald eagles. That's what I remember from my education. But now we do. So it's a tough thing to balance.
Yeah, I was going to comment, we do have laws and regulations related to the discharge from factory scale farming. And in the current environment of trying to get rid of regulations, we need to make sure that the pendulum doesn't swing too far, because then we'll really see degradation in our streams, even more than we have now. We have laws, we need to enforce them and make sure they don't get too watered down.
You know, it's taken decades to get where we are with our current incentive system and food production, and it's going to take decades to sort of get to a better place. So the issue you bring up, I think, is a really important one, but it's also a really big one. But just a note, the work we're doing with farmers in western Nebraska is actually funded by Coca-Cola. And they actually have very ambitious goals to make up for the water consumption in their products by funding water conservation projects around the world, and they're not alone. And what's changed is, and it's not just greenwashing, it's not just being able to tell a better marketing story. They really are concerned about the sustainability of their supply chain, just like we're concerned about this, you know, potable water and will we have enough water. The major food companies are waking up. Why are they waking up? Because consumers are saying we want more sustainable products. So that to me is a very hopeful sign, because they are, we're very small. Our annual budget's like $3 million. Coca-Cola spends, billions. So when the Coca-Colas and the Cargills and the big food companies of the world start saying, hey, we need to do agriculture in a different way, that really sends a very strong signal to the marketplace, to farmers, that conservation groups and others alone can't. So I think there's very hopeful signs there, and it's really coming from us as consumers wanting more sustainable products. So keep it up.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and give our moderator and panelists another round of applause.